Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video, kinda. We're going to use this video as a kind of a jumping off point for a conversation about one of the most famous units from the American Civil War, and that is the Irish Brigade. With my upcoming trip to Washington, D.C. and Gettysburg this weekend, you can expect a lot of content centered around Arlington National Cemetery and around the events of the Battle of Gettysburg. And one of the places I plan on highlighting this weekend when I'm in Gettysburg is the wheat field at Gettysburg, and in particular the Irish Brigade. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to watch this video from Lionheart Filmworks. Lionheart Filmworks, I don't know if they necessarily made this video. They've kind of become almost like a depository for a lot of film about history. And so a lot of their stuff, they have some original stuff on their channel, but they also have a lot of content from other places they've kind of brought all into one place. So I don't know exactly who made this originally, but I'll link in the description to Lionheart Filmworks, which is where I'm watching this. So yeah, the Irish Brigade, interesting, and I'm sure we'll learn some of this as we go along, but what's amazing about the Irish Brigade is you have thousands of regiments in the American Civil War between the Union and the Confederacy. Some regiments never saw a major battle in their entire existence. Others might have been in a major battle here and there, but only found themselves in the thick of the fight a few times. And then there are regiments, or there are units like the Irish Brigade, which is multiple regiments, that end up finding themselves in the worst part of pretty much every fight. So the Irish Brigade's at Malvern Hill, and several other of the 7 Days fights. They assault the Bloody Lane at Antietam. They charge up Marie's Heights at Fredericksburg, and they go into the wheat field at Gettysburg. I mean, they are in some of the bloodiest places and some of the bloodiest battles of the war. And it's just amazing to me that anybody survived all of that. And a lot of them didn't. I mean, by the time they get to Gettysburg, they're the size of a regiment, and they're 5 regiments. So they were decimated big time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and dive into this video today.
The battles of 1862 prove that a few of the many old city regiments in the Army, these regiments being a fair percentage of the Army of the Potomac between April and December 1862, would establish a tough fighting reputation from the many city rogues and skinflints of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia.
So yeah, you have to recognize that in the American Civil War, the vast majority of regiments are recruited from one single area. So wherever you live, if you're in the United States, there's a good chance that there's a regiment that was local to where you live. So like where I live, the 105th Ohio, the 20th Ohio, the 6th Ohio Cavalry, these are units who came right from the area where I live. So most of the men who fought from where I live fought in those units and a couple of others. If one of those regiments was in a major battle, I think it was Shelby Foote who in the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, he said that, they might find out in a particular town that after a battle, there were no young men left from that town. Thinking about units like the 26th North Carolina, where you had one company where the entire company was wiped out at Gettysburg. The 1st Minnesota is another example. These are, when that happens, that it can be devastating to a community. And so the Irish Brigade, they're primarily Irish immigrants who come from New York City, and then eventually some from Boston and other places. You have a lot of regiments that are made up primarily of immigrants. You've got all German regiments that are in the Army of the Potomac. You've got these Irish regiments. You've got other groups.
Sometimes these units were just ethnic clubs that had mustered into regiments to build a distinct esprit de corps. But none of these ethnic city regiments surpassed the reputation of the Irish Brigade.
Yeah, and I'll pause again because he makes a good point. There were certain units that were made up not even just of communities, but of specific groups within that community. So you have entire units made up of a bunch of coal miners from Pennsylvania. You've got one Massachusetts regiment that's called the Harvard Regiment that charged through the city of Fredericksburg during the crossing, and I talked about that in my Fredericksburg video. That's made up of all of these guys that went to Harvard.
The brigade was established from a nucleus of New York City regiments of exclusively Irish volunteers, and were ultimately led by Brigadier General Thomas Francis Mahar.
Now, I've never heard it pronounced Mahar before. It's spelled Meagher, which looks like meager. But I think typically I've heard it pronounced as Maher. And you actually see people with the name Maher. One of my wife's best friends, her last name is Maher, which is kind of an anglicized version of that Irish name Maher. But I've usually seen it as Maher.
Irish exile who was once to be executed by the English government. He was referred to as Mahar the Sword, and would be fearless in battle and beloved by his men. His men were working-class tradesmen, laborers, and dock workers from New York City. The 63rd, 69th, and 88th New York regiments fought well for McClellan around Richmond, but would seal its name to proper military fame by its attack at the Sunken Road at Antietam on September 17, 1862.
Some of the fiercest fighting of the war.
The brigade marched into attack to crest the rise above the Sunken Road some 50 yards before the Confederate defenders. The Confederates unleashed protected volleys, and whole clumps of men went down in the tall grass. The Irish regiments slowed at the crest and fought on until relieved.
The bravery of men on either side to march into the face of this kind of fire. If you saw my video from the most recent video from Vicksburg, you saw my friend Ryan Burns talking about the nature of men firing. At 50 yards with a rifled musket, it is pretty much impossible to miss a target that you're aiming at. It just is. It's impossible. At that distance, with that accurate weapon, with a mini ball especially. Now, granted, not all the Confederates had rifled muskets with mini balls. A lot of them had smooth bores. But even at 50 yards, a massed fire would just tear holes in the line. And Ryan talked about this, about how it's human nature to not want to kill your fellow man, even if that fellow man is trying to kill you. And so a lot of the men would deliberately miss, or at least deliberately not aim directly at somebody. So it could have been a lot worse. But to march massed in lines into the face of an enemy that had massed fire on you like that, I mean, it's just horrendous to even think about the bravery that these men must have had.
These Irish immigrants had to prove loyalty to their new American home, despite the anti-Irish feelings rampant throughout the North. They had to prove their love of the flag. This could be illustrated by the 63rd New York, whose colors were shot down 16 times. The Irish regiments left approximately 60% of their men dead and wounded on the field at Antietam.
And that's not even the last time they would suffer that kind of casualties. And he makes a good point. The Irish were not only immigrants, they were Catholic immigrants in a time when both were looked down upon. If you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, you see how often Irish immigrants were viewed. And so, yeah, these men did feel like they had something to prove to this new country, which is unfortunate that that's the way it is, but that's the reality, and it probably is a reason why they fought harder than many of the other units.
The Irish New Yorkers were joined in November 1862 by another Irish
28th
regiment,
Massachusetts.
a Boston regiment, the 28th Massachusetts. And then an Irish regiment from Philadelphia, the 116th Pennsylvania. The two new regiments strengthened the brigade with needed manpower.
Probably doubled their size.
All the troops were unified under the Green Irish and their red, white, and blue American colors.
And at Fredericksburg, they would wear these sprigs of I think clovers or something in their hats, and you can see that in the movie Gods and Generals.
On December 13, 1862, the brigade would continue and cement their hard-fighting reputation with their rush upon Confederate defenses at Marye's Heights in the disastrous Battle of Fredericksburg.
Brutal.
Because the New York Irishmen were without their previously damaged green flags, General Mahar had 2 orderlies distribute evergreen boxwood
Evergreens,
sprigs
that's what it
to
was.
the men to place in their caps. The brigade of approximately 1,400 officers and men rushed from the cover of night.
And again, almost lost half of them.
They attacked the heights, with many of the men raising the yell of Fa'abala in their native Gaelic, meaning clear the way.
I always wondered what that meant, clear the way. So, contrary to popular belief, even though it was December there in central Virginia, in that morning, if you live in an area like Ohio, even Virginia, which is further south and a little warmer climate, November, December, you can have days where it could be in the 60s during the day, but be like in the 20s or 30s in the morning. And this morning was like that. The assault on Marye's Heights, the Battle of Fredericksburg, takes place on one of those days where it's like the 30s in the morning. But by afternoon, it gets up into the 60s. It was actually a pretty sunny, warm day that day. So a lot of times you see it kind of portrayed as being this really cold, wintry day, but it wasn't.
The Southern artillery concentrated on the Irish, who pushed hard for the Confederate-defended stone wall. One Irishman called the flashes of muskets and artillery explosions blinding as they neared the Confederate position. General Mahar was shot from his horse by the shrapnel of an artillery round, and the brigade took cover to the churned and frozen ground.
But he did survive. He died, I believe he drowned, like out in Montana or something, a couple years after the war. I don't know what would have been worse, the assault on the Bloody Lane at Antietam or the assault up Marye's Heights at Fredericksburg. These are 2 just disastrously horrible assaults for those who had to make them. And then, of course, the wheat field, the same thing. These are some of the bloodiest places on earth in the 1860s.
30 yards from the wall, and traded shot for shot. The brigade fought, as at Antietam, until relieved. The brigade left on the field 53 of their 92 officers killed and wounded, and almost 500 enlisted men gone forever. The Irish Brigade established a reputation for tenacity and stubbornness earned with blood. Their reputation ultimately marked the early identity of the Army of the Potomac. At both Chancellorsville and at Gettysburg in 1863, the brigade continued its excellent service, with many of the Irish patriots fighting on through Appomattox as part of reduced Irish Brigade regiments.
Yeah, so after at the wheat field at Gettysburg, so by Gettysburg, there's like 550 men or something in the entire brigade. This is 5 regiments, and they average about the size of a company, each of these regiments. The entire brigade's the size of a medium-sized regiment. And I think John Kelly was the commanding officer at that point, and they very famously have their chaplain give them absolution before they go into battle. And it's the last time that they'll fight as the Irish Brigade, because they go into the wheat field. And the wheat field was just this tangled mess where you have elements from 3 different Union Corps that get kind of hurled into battle from different sides, and it changes hands multiple times. And so the Irish Brigade is one of these units that gets hurled into there, and by the time they're done with that battle, there's nothing left of them, and so they just kind of get dispersed into other regiments or other brigades.
The men are still models of identity and heroism in Mr. Lincoln's Army. The real maturity of the Army of the Potomac occurred when in 1862 winter quarters at Falmouth, Virginia, between the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, while under the command of Fighting Joe Hooker. Though the men had served under McClellan and Burnside, Hooker was a proven fighting man who had a familiar attachment to his men that they enjoyed. Inside of those winter hut cities across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg, the veterans bonded with new recruits, and everyone mended tattered uniforms, wrote letters, read soldier manuals, and lived for a few months out of the rain, mud, and snow. Hooker made them feel indestructible. He attempted
and then they got their butts kicked in one of the most one-sided battles of the war. In terms, I mean, they outnumbered the Confederates 2-1, and the surprise flank attack by Jackson, that whole bit.
Provide for them all sorts of rations and sutler goods, routine target practice to build the shooting confidence of the men, and had grand reviews to build the army to 120,000 men. He wanted the men to be ready to destroy Lee. The men would march from their huts in the spring of 1863, the best fed, best armed, and best trained they had ever been. Gettysburg would prove that fact, but not with Hooker still in command.
Nope. That's cool. I love, and they have these videos where they do a review of Civil War uniforms, and they show a bunch of different. It's really, really cool. We might have to check those out sometime. And the 69th New York, by the way, still exists today in the U.S. Army. They fought as recently as in the Iraq War. They were a unit that, a lot of American military units have lineage that traces back to units in the Civil War and even back to the Revolutionary War in some cases. I know Alexander Hamilton's battery that he commanded in the Revolution still exists today in the U.S. Army. But the 69th New York is the only part of the Irish Brigade that still exists today. It's part of the New York National Guard. But yeah, they fought in Iraq. All right, that was pretty cool. So let me know your thoughts. We're definitely going to talk about the Irish Brigade in Gettysburg. If there's a particular thing you'd like me to highlight and do a video about, let me know. I'm thinking my mindset with this trip to Gettysburg. I've been there so many times. I'm trying to find something new to tell a story about. So I'm probably going to do some lesser known stories rather than major stuff. I'm not going to do a video about like I did last time, which was that 45-minute video retracing Longstreet's assault. Most people who study Gettysburg know about Longstreet's assault. I want to find some stories that maybe people aren't familiar with. So we're going to try to tell some of those, but we'll also talk about things like the Irish Brigade. I've done a video about the 1st Minnesota before, and the 20th Maine and things like that. So we're going to try to find those stories. So let me know if there's a particular story you'd love to see me highlight at Gettysburg. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you from Gettysburg later this week. Thanks for watching.